Blood pooled on cold asphalt, staining expensive Italian leather. Gasping for air, a notorious crime syndicate leader clutched his chest. Rain poured down relentlessly, washing away crimson trails into nearby storm drains. Footsteps echoed in a dark alleyway. Out of nowhere, a tiny figure emerged from shadows. 7-year-old Toby gripped a heavy medical bag, dragging it toward a dying man. Tears streamed down his dirt-smudged face. "My aunt is coming. She's a nurse. She can save you," he cried out. Destiny shifted that night, binding a ruthless underworld king to an ordinary woman desperately trying to survive. The neon sign of O'Reilly's pub flickered against the brick walls of the alleyway, casting a sickly, intermittent glow over the dumpsters. Matteo Bianchi, the undisputed head of the Bianchi crime family, leaned heavily against the damp brickwork. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. A sniper's bullet had torn through his side just beneath his ribs, a cowardly ambush executed in the supposedly neutral territory of the warehouse district. Matteo pressed a hand over his expensive tailored suit jacket, feeling the warm, sticky spread of his own life slipping away. His security detail was dead, gunned down before they could even draw their weapons. Matteo had managed to slip away into the labyrinth of back alleys, driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and the cold, hard refusal to die on a dirty sidewalk. But the adrenaline was fading. His legs felt like lead, and black spots danced across his vision. He stumbled, his knees colliding harshly with the wet concrete. Above him, the rusty metal of a fire escape groaned. Matteo reached for his shoulder holster, his vision swimming. He expected to see the muzzle of a silenced pistol pointed at his face. Instead, a small, pale face peered down from the second-floor landing. It was a boy, no older than 7, wearing oversized Spider-Man pajamas and clutching a battered flashlight. Toby Fitzgerald had been strictly forbidden from going out onto the fire escape, especially after dark, but his Aunt Nora was late. She had been working a grueling double shift at Mercy General Hospital, and Toby, burdened by a chronic childhood anxiety he couldn't quite articulate, had crept out to watch the street for her familiar battered sedan. He scrambled down the iron stairs, his small sneakers slapping against the metal. He didn't see a terrifying monster of the underworld, he just saw a man who was hurt and bleeding. "Hey," Toby whispered, stepping cautiously into the alley. He illuminated Matteo's face with the harsh beam of the flashlight. Matteo winced, raising a bloody hand to shield his eyes. "Go away, kid," Matteo rasped, tasting copper on his tongue. "Get out of here." "You're bleeding a lot," Toby observed, his voice trembling but remarkably steady for a child. He turned his head toward the entrance of the alley. The familiar rumble of a rusty engine echoed down the street. The headlights of Nora's sedan swept across the brick walls. Toby dropped his flashlight and ran toward the street. "Aunt Nora! Aunt Nora!" Matteo cursed softly, trying to drag himself deeper into the shadows. Involving civilians was a death sentence for them. The men who shot him would be sweeping the area, but his body refused to obey. He collapsed fully onto his side, the cold rain seeping into his bones. Nora Fitzgerald threw her car into park, not even bothering to turn off the engine when she saw Toby running toward her in the rain. Panic seized her throat. "Toby, what are you doing outside? I told you to stay." "There's a man! He's dying!" Toby grabbed her hand, practically dragging her toward the dark mouth of the alley. "I told him you could fix him. My aunt is coming. She's a nurse. She can save you," he yelled into the darkness. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She was exhausted, her feet throbbing from 14 hours on the trauma ward, but her training kicked in instantly. She grabbed her emergency trauma kit from the trunk, a habit she maintained from her days working as an EMT before she got her nursing degree. She followed Toby into the alley, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. When she saw the man on the ground, she gasped. He was a large man, impeccably dressed, but his clothes were ruined with blood. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nora dropped to her knees beside him, uncaring of the muddy puddles soaking through her scrubs. She unzipped her kit and pulled out a heavy pair of trauma shears. "I'm a nurse. I need to see the wound." Matteo grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His dark eyes, usually cold and calculating, were glazed with pain. "No hospitals," he ground out. "You're going into hypovolemic shock," Nora said firmly, prying his fingers off her wrist. "If I don't stop the bleeding, you'll be dead in 10 minutes. She cut away his jacket and shirt, exposing the entry wound. It was a clean shot, but it had nicked something vital. Blood was pulsing out in a rhythmic flow. "Toby, turn around and face the wall," she ordered sharply. The boy obeyed instantly. Nora packed the wound with gauze, pressing down with all her weight. Mateo let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back against the brick. "I know it hurts. Stay with me," Nora pleaded. She looked at his face properly for the first time. He possessed a brutal, sharp-angled kind of handsome, with a strong jaw and a shadow of dark stubble. He didn't look like a victim of a random mugging. Suddenly, the screech of tires echoed at the end of the alley. Two sleek black SUVs blocked the exit. Doors slammed and heavy footsteps approached rapidly. Nora froze, her hands still slick with Mateo's blood. She instinctively positioned her body between the approaching men and Toby. "Boss," a harsh voice barked. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his cheek stepped into the light. This was Dante Russo, Mateo's most trusted enforcer. He held an assault rifle, the barrel purring debacted, the barrel pointed directly at Nora's chest. "Step away from him," Dante commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. "If I take my hands off this wound, he bleeds out." Nora fired back, her voice shaking but her hands remaining perfectly still. Mateo forced his eyes open, looking up at Dante. "Dante," he wheezed. "She stopped it. Barely." Dante looked from the dying boss to the terrified nurse, and then to the small boy cowering near the wall. He made a split-second decision. "Grab them," he ordered the two men behind him. "What? No, I have to take him to Mercy General." Nora screamed as heavy hands grabbed her shoulders. "He's not going to a hospital," Dante sneered. "And neither are you. You're coming with us. If he dies, you die. Grab the kid." "Don't touch him!" Nora shrieked, kicking wildly as a thug scooped up a screaming Toby. "I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt my nephew." "Then keep your hands on the wound and shut up," Dante said. They were shoved into the back of the SUV. Nora was forced to straddle Mateo on the floorboards, her hands pressing desperately against his side as the vehicle tore through the rain-slicked streets of the city, plunging her into a dark, terrifying world she knew nothing about. The ride was a blur of neon lights and terrifying silence, broken only by Mateo's shallow breathing and Toby's muffled sobs. Nora kept her eyes fixed on her bloody hands, applying constant pressure. She was hyperventilating, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. She was a pediatric trauma nurse. She saved lives for a living. She never expected to be kidnapped by the Mafia to do it. The SUVs finally passed through a set of imposing wrought iron gates, pulling up to a sprawling, secluded estate deep in upstate New York. It was a fortress disguised as a luxury mansion, registered under a dummy corporation, Caldwell Holdings. "Get him inside! The dining room table!" Dante barked. Men swarmed the vehicle, hauling Mateo out. Nora scrambled after them, clutching Toby tightly by the hand. They burst into a magnificent room adorned with crystal chandeliers and mahogany furniture. With a violent sweep of his arm, Dante cleared the priceless china off the long dining table. It shattered against the hardwood floor. "Put him down," Dante ordered. He turned to Nora, tossing her trauma kit onto a nearby chair. "Fix him." Nora stared at the blood-soaked man on the table. "I am a nurse, not a surgeon. I can stabilize him, but the bullet needs to be extracted, and any internal bleeding needs to be cauterized. You need a sterile operating room." Dante stepped into her personal space, the smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne rolling off him. He pulled a heavy silver handgun from his waistband and pressed the barrel against the center of her forehead. Nora gasped, her eyes crossing slightly to look at the weapon. Behind her, Toby let out a terrified whimper. "Listen to me very carefully," Dante whispered, his eyes dead. "There is no hospital, there is no doctor, there is only you. If you don't take that bullet out, I will shoot you, and then I will shoot the boy. Do we have an understanding?" A cold, primal maternal instinct washed over Nora, completely overriding her panic. She could not fail. She would not let Toby die. She pushed the barrel of the gun away with a trembling, blood-stained finger. "I need boiling water. I need high-proof alcohol. I need every towel in this house, and if you have a first aid kit with surgical clamps or forceps, get it now, and get my nephew out of this room. He doesn't need to see this." Dante stared at her for a long moment, impressed despite himself. He nodded to one of his men. "Take the kid to the library. Lock the door. Bring her what she asked for. For the next 2 hours, the dining room became a makeshift theater of blood and sweat. Nora sterilized a pair of needle-nose pliers with vodka and a lighter. She worked purely on instinct and adrenaline, her hands miraculously steady as she dug into Matteo's flesh. Matteo was semi-conscious, groaning through a leather belt Dante had forced between his teeth. Nora's focus narrowed down to the torn muscle, the slippery blood, and the metallic glint of the bullet lodged dangerously close to the kidney. "I've got it," she panted, her forehead dripping with sweat. With a sickening squelch, she extracted the deformed slug and dropped it into a crystal water glass. It clinked heavily against the bottom. She quickly packed the wound, applied a makeshift pressure dressing, and started an IV line using a bag of saline she had in her trauma kit. When she finally stepped back, her knees buckled. Dante caught her by the arm, keeping her upright. "He's stable," Nora gasped, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "But infection is going to be the real killer. He needs broad-spectrum antibiotics, IV fluids, and rest." Dante looked down at his boss. Matteo's breathing had evened out, the deathly pallor retreating slightly from his skin. Dante turned back to Nora, his expression unreadable. "You did good, nurse." "Can I take my nephew and go home now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "No." The voice was raspy, weak, but commanded absolute authority. Nora snapped her head toward the table. Matteo had spat out the belt. His dark eyes were fixed on her, calculating and intense. He was awake. "Boss," Dante said, stepping forward. "She saw our faces. She knows the Caldwell estate. I should get rid of her." Nora's blood ran cold. She took a step back, looking around frantically for a weapon. "You touch a hair on her head, Dante, and I'll cut off your hands," Matteo rasped, pushing himself up slightly on one elbow. He winced in agony, but refused to lie back down. He looked at Nora, his gaze piercing through her. "She saved my life. The boy saved my life. We do not kill the people who save us. It's bad for business." "Then what do we do with them?" Dante demanded. "They stay," Matteo said, "until I am fully recovered, until we find out who sold me out." He let his head fall back against the table, his eyes locking onto Nora's horrified face. "Welcome to your new home, sweetheart. Try to make yourself comfortable." A week passed inside the golden cage of the Caldwell estate. For Toby, it was an unexpected vacation. The Mafia enforcers, hardened killers who wouldn't hesitate to snap a man's neck, were strangely awkward and deferential around the child. They fed him ice cream, let him play endless video games on an enormous flat-screen TV in the library, and told him his aunt was taking care of a very rich, very sick businessman. Toby, buffered by the luxuries he had never experienced in their cramped apartment, remained blissfully ignorant of the crosshairs trained on their backs. For Nora, it was a waking nightmare. She lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. She was a prisoner, yet she was also the most important person in the house. Matteo Bianchi's life rested entirely in her hands. She treated him twice a day in the master suite, a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a dense, impenetrable forest. The windows, she noted grimly, were bulletproof. "You're pressing too hard," Matteo growled as Nora swabbed his healing wound with antiseptic. He was sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed, his broad, heavily scarred chest bare. "I have to clean it thoroughly, Mr. Bianchi," Nora replied coolly, not pausing her movements. "Unless you'd prefer sepsis to take you out, instead of a rival's bullet." Matteo looked down at her. He was accustomed to people trembling in his presence. His men averted their eyes, his enemies begged for mercy. But Nora Fitzgerald did neither. She treated him with the brisk, clinical authority of a woman used to wrangling uncooperative patients. She wore borrowed clothes, a cashmere sweater, and silk sweatpants that swallowed her petite frame, yet she carried herself with a fierce, unbreakable dignity. "You're a brave woman, Nora," Matteo said softly. It was the first time he had used her name. "Or a very foolish one." "I'm a mother," she corrected, taping down a fresh gauze pad. "Or, near enough. My sister passed away 5 years ago. Toby is all I have. You can threaten me. You can keep me locked in this ridiculous mansion. But if anything happens to that boy, I will kill you myself. Do you understand?" Matteo's lips twitched into a ghost of a smile. "I believe you. I gave you my word, Nora. You and the boy are safe here." "Safe?" Nora scoffed, packing her supplies away. "You're a criminal, a mobster." Someone tried to blow a hole through your chest a week ago, and you think we're safe sitting in your house? The amusement vanished from Mateo's eyes, replaced by a dark, simmering storm. My syndicate has a rat. Someone high up gave the order to hit me at O'Reilly's. Only 5 men knew I would be there. Why are you telling me this? Nora asked, backing away toward the door. Because right now, you are the only person in this house I know I can trust, Mateo said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. You had a dozen chances to let me die. You could have nicked an artery during the extraction. You could have poisoned my IV. You didn't. You're an outsider, Nora, which means you're clean. Nora crossed her arms, trying to suppress the shiver that ran down her spine. The way he looked at her was unsettling. It wasn't just the gaze of a captive relying on his captor. There was a heavy magnetic pull between them that terrified her more than Dante's gun ever did. I didn't kill you because I took an oath to save lives, Nora said, her voice wavering slightly. Not because I care about your mob politics. Maybe, Mateo murmured, leaning forward. But you care about what happens next, don't you? Before Nora could answer, the heavy oak door swung open. Dante strode in, his face pale and taut with tension. He glanced at Nora, then locked eyes with Mateo. Boss, Dante said, his voice clipped. We found something. You need to hear this. Mateo's demeanor shifted instantly. The intriguing, almost vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the ruthless apex predator of the underworld. Report. We intercepted a burner phone message, Dante said, hesitating slightly as he glanced at Nora again. It was sent from inside this house. Last night, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Nora's eyes widened. To who? Mateo asked, his voice deadly quiet. To the Rossi family, Dante replied. They know you're alive, boss, and they know exactly where we are. Mateo slowly stood up, ignoring the twinge of pain in his side. He looked at Dante, then slowly turned his gaze toward Nora. The trust he had spoken of mere seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a chilling paranoia. Lock down the estate, Mateo ordered, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. Nobody leaves. If anyone approaches the gates, shoot to kill. And Dante? Yes, boss. Put a guard on the boy's door. Nora's breath hitched. Mateo, please. Get out, Mateo commanded, his voice as cold as ice. Nora fled the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The golden cage had just become a war zone, and she and Toby were caught dead in the center. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the resonant thud echoing like a gunshot in Nora's ears. She stood frozen in the opulent hallway of the Caldwell estate, her breathing shallow and rapid. A towering enforcer named Bruno, a man whose neck was thicker than Nora's waist, immediately stepped in front of Toby's bedroom door, folding his massive arms across his chest. His jacket bulged, betraying the heavy-caliber weapon holstered beneath it. Nora's maternal instincts flared into a blinding, white-hot rage that temporarily eclipsed her terror. She marched directly up to Bruno, tilting her head back to glare into his impassive eyes. If you so much as look at him the wrong way, Nora hissed, her voice trembling with a ferocious intensity, I will take a scalpel to your carotid artery while you sleep. Do you understand me? Bruno blinked, clearly taken aback by the sheer venom radiating from the petite nurse. He gave a stiff, single nod. Just following orders, ma'am. Boss says the kid stays in the room. Nora spun on her heel and retreated to her own adjacent quarters. She slammed her door, locking it before sinking to the plush carpet. Her hands shook violently as she buried her face in her knees. The Rossi family. The name meant nothing to her a week ago, but she had spent enough time listening to the hushed, urgent whispers of Matteo's men to know that Giovanni Rossi was a ruthless butcher who specialized in cartel-style executions. If Rossi's men breached the estate, they wouldn't leave witnesses. A pediatric nurse and a 7-year-old boy would be nothing but collateral damage. She needed to think. She possessed a master's degree in nursing from Johns Hopkins University. Her entire career was built on high-pressure critical thinking and remaining calm when blood hit the floor. She forced her heart rate down, analyzing the situation clinically. Matteo thought she sent the message. But how? She had been stripped of her own smartphone the moment she stepped out of the SUV. She had no access to the estate's Wi-Fi, which was heavily encrypted by former Constellas security contractors. Furthermore, Dante had proudly boasted just 2 days ago that the entire Caldwell property was blanketed by a military-grade signal jammer to prevent drone surveillance and unauthorized cellular transmissions. A signal jammer, Nora thought, her eyes widening. She scrambled to her feet. You couldn't send a burner phone message through a military-grade jamming field unless you knew exactly where the blind spots were. And only someone intimately involved with the estate security grid would possess that kind of highly classified architectural knowledge. Nora didn't wait for permission. She unlocked her door, bypassed a startled Bruno, and marched straight back down the sweeping mahogany staircase toward Matteo's makeshift command center in the billiard room. 2 armed guards moved to block the double doors. "Nobody goes in, Doc," one of them growled, resting his hand on the grip of his Sig Sauer P-226. "Move," Nora commanded, channeling every ounce of authority she used to clear an emergency room. "If you don't let me through, your boss is going to murder the wrong person, and the real mole is going to open the front gates for the Rossi family." The guards exchanged an uncertain look. Before they could decide, the doors opened from the inside. Dante stood there, his face a mask of exhausted fury. Behind him, Matteo sat at the head of a long table strewn with blueprints and laptops, looking dangerously pale but terrifyingly alert. "I told you to stay upstairs," Matteo said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "You're an idiot," Nora snapped, pushing past Dante and marching right up to the table. The entire room of hardened criminals fell dead silent. Nobody called Matteo Bianchi an idiot and kept their teeth. Matteo's dark eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint sparking in their depths. "Excuse me? You think I sent a message to a rival Mafia boss?" Nora planted her hands on the table, leaning closer to him. "With what? Telepathy? Dante confiscated my phone. And even if I had a burner, Dante bragged that this entire property is shielded by signal jammers. So tell me, Mr. Bianchi, how does a civilian nurse from upstate know exactly where the security blind spots are in your multi-million-dollar fortress?" Silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. Matteo held her gaze, searching her face for any trace of deception. The cold paranoia in his eyes slowly fractured, replaced by a sudden, sharp realization. He looked past her, his gaze locking onto a man standing near the window. It was Silas Mercer, the head of perimeter security. Silas was a former private military contractor who had overseen the installation of the jammer network. "Silas," Matteo said softly. The sheer quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. Silas stiffened. "Boss, you can't listen to this crazy." "Dante, check his pockets," Matteo ordered. Silas didn't wait. He lunged for the side door, drawing his weapon in a fluid, desperate motion. The room erupted into chaos. Dante was faster, tackling Silas to the Persian rug before he could level the gun. The 2 men crashed into a side table, shattering a heavy crystal lamp. 2 other enforcers piled on, wrestling the weapon from Silas's grip and pinning his arms violently behind his back. Dante ruthlessly patted down the struggling security chief, pulling a cheap, plastic, disposable cell phone from his inner jacket pocket. Dante tossed it onto the table in front of Matteo. Matteo picked up the phone, his face devoid of all emotion. He turned it over in his large, scarred hands, then looked down at the man bleeding on his floor. "How much, Silas?" Matteo asked, his voice hollow. "How much did Giovanni Rossi pay you to sell out my life?" "They have my brother, Matteo," Silas choked out, spitting blood onto the rug. "They grabbed him in Brooklyn. They said they'd send him back to me in pieces if I didn't give up your location." Matteo's jaw tightened. "So you traded my family for yours." He stood up slowly, swaying slightly as his healing abdominal muscles protested the movement. He pulled a sleek, suppressed pistol from the waistband of his trousers. Nora's breath hitched. "Matteo, no," she whispered, grabbing his forearm. "You can't. Not here. Not with Toby in the house." Matteo looked at her hand resting on his arm, then up to her wide, terrified eyes. The monster inside him, the ruthless syndicate leader who maintained power through absolute, unforgiving violence, demanded blood. But the presence of this woman, this fiercely protective nurse who had dug a bullet out of his flesh, hesitated his trigger finger. He slowly lowered the weapon. "Take him to the soundproof holding cells in the basement," Matteo ordered Dante, never breaking eye contact with Nora. "Find out exactly what he told Rossi, then get rid of him." As Silas was dragged screaming from the room, Matteo sank back into his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He looked at Nora, a complex mixture of gratitude and weary resignation in his eyes. "You're smarter than my entire security detail, Nora," he murmured. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me an apology," Nora said, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to crash. "You owe me a way out of here. Because if Rossi knows where we are, this house isn't a fortress anymore. It's a tomb." Matteo looked at the blueprints on the table, a grim shadow falling over his harsh features. "You're right. Pack your things. Pack the boys' things. We move out at midnight." But midnight was an optimistic luxury they did not have, because at exactly 10:45 p.m., the sky above the Caldwell estate tore open with a deafening roar of high explosives, and the golden cage shattered into a million pieces. The explosion was violent enough to shake the foundations of the mansion, throwing Nora hard against the wall of her bedroom. The heavy bulletproof windows vibrated with a terrifying hum, and the crystal chandelier in the hallway violently swung, raining shards of glass onto the hardwood floors. Sirens blared to life, a high-pitched wail that cut through the sudden darkness as the main power grid was instantly severed. Emergency red lighting flickered on, casting the estate in a demonic blood-red glow. Aunt Nora, Toby's scream pierced through the ringing in her ears. Nora scrambled to her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain in her shoulder, and sprinted into the hallway. Bruno, the massive guard, was already moving, his weapon drawn. "Get into the boys' room! Stay away from the windows!" Bruno roared, shoving Nora toward the door just as a barrage of automatic gunfire erupted from the front lawn. The heavy rhythmic thud of a Browning M2 machine gun tore through the night, chewing the beautiful stone facade of the mansion to dust. Nora burst into the room and dove onto the bed, wrapping her body entirely around a sobbing Toby. "I've got you, baby, I've got you," she chanted, pressing his face into her chest so he wouldn't see the muzzle flashes lighting up the tree line outside. Downstairs, the estate had turned into a war zone. Matteo, fueled by sheer adrenaline-laced rage, was barking orders over the deafening cacophony of gunfire. His wound tore open with his first violent movement, warm blood instantly soaking the fresh bandages Nora had applied hours ago, but he ignored it. He grabbed an assault rifle from the armory cache in the study, chambering a round with a vicious snap. They breached the main gate. 2 armored trucks, at least 30 men. Dante yelled over the comms, taking cover behind a marble pillar as bullets shattered the priceless antique vases around him. "Hold the choke point at the foyer. Do not let them reach the stairs," Matteo ordered, firing controlled bursts down the hallway. He watched 2 of Rossi's foot soldiers drop, but there were too many of them. Rossi had sent a small army. "Boss, we can't hold this," Bruno yelled from the top of the stairs, firing down into the swirling smoke and chaos below. "They've got RPGs." "Fall back to the panic room," Matteo commanded. "Bruno, get the girl and the kid!" Nora didn't wait to be told twice. When Bruno kicked her door open and motioned frantically, she scooped Toby up into her arms. He was heavy, but primal fear gave her the strength of 10 men. She ran blindly through the red-lit corridors, following Bruno's massive, retreating form. They rushed toward the West Wing library. Matteo and Dante were already there, providing covering fire as the surviving enforcers retreated. Matteo was a terrifying sight. His white shirt was completely soaked in dark crimson, his face pale and contorted in agony, but his eyes were wide and manic, firing with deadly precision. "Behind the bookcase," Matteo shouted, hitting a concealed switch under the mahogany desk. The massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf groaned and swung inward, revealing a steel-reinforced doorway. Bruno shoved Nora and Toby inside, followed by Dante and the remaining 2 guards. Matteo was the last one in. He laid down a final, suppressive volley of fire before throwing himself through the heavy steel door. Dante slammed it shut and threw the massive locking bolts, just as a tremendous explosion rocked the library outside, shaking the dust from the concrete ceiling of the bunker. The silence inside the panic room was sudden and absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the survivors. The room was sparsely furnished with cots, medical supplies, and a bank of security monitors that now displayed nothing but static. Matteo dropped his rifle. It clattered loudly against the concrete. He took 1 step, swayed dangerously, and collapsed onto the cold floor. "Matteo!" Nora screamed, handing Toby to Dante without a second thought. She dropped to her knees beside the Mafia boss, her hands frantically tearing at his bloody shirt. He was hemorrhaging. The violent exertion had ripped the internal sutures she had meticulously placed days ago. Blood was pooling beneath him at a terrifying rate. "Need a med kit, now." Nora barked, her professional demeanor instantly overriding her panic. Dante scrambled to the wall, ripping a heavy red trauma bag from its mounting and tossing it to her. "Nora." Matteo gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. His skin was ice cold, drenched in a clammy sweat, classic signs of severe hypovolemic shock. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Matteo Bianchi," Nora threatened, her hands moving with lightning speed, as she packed the wound with quick-clot combat gauze, applying brutal, agonizing pressure. Matteo let out a weak, strangled cry, his hand weakly reaching up to grip her wrist. "Take the tunnel," he whispered, coughing weakly. "Back wall. Leads. To the aqueduct. Dante will get you out." "I am not leaving you here to die," Nora yelled, tears of frustration blurring her vision. She looked up at Dante. "He needs immediate surgery. He needs a transfusion. If we stay down here, he bleeds to death in 20 minutes. If we open that door, Rossi's men will slaughter us all," Dante argued, his face grim. "He said there's a tunnel." Nora pointed to the back wall. "We carry him. He's a 200-pound dead weight, Doc. We'll never outrun them carrying him through a mile of drainage pipes. Then I'll carry him myself." Nora snarled, her eyes blazing with a fierce, irrational defiance that stunned every hardened killer in the room. She looked down at Matteo, her hands covered in his blood. "I did not perform emergency surgery on a dining room table, just to watch you give up and die in a concrete box. Do you hear me? You fight." Matteo's dark eyes focused on her face, captivated by the raw, untamed fire in her spirit. In his brutal world, people abandoned the weak to survive. Betrayal was currency. Yet here was a woman who owed him nothing, a woman he had kidnapped and imprisoned, fiercely refusing to let him fall. He swallowed hard, forcing a weak, bloody smile. "You are a very stubborn woman, Nora. And you're a terrible patient," she shot back, her voice breaking. She looked at Dante. "Help me get him up. We are leaving. Now." Dante stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Bruno, grab the kid. You two take the rear. Doc, you keep pressure on that wound. If he dies while we're moving, I'm leaving his body behind." They triggered the heavy blast door at the rear of the bunker, revealing a dark, damp concrete tunnel that smelled of moss and stale water. Dante hauled Matteo to his feet, throwing the boss's heavy arm over his shoulder. Nora pressed herself against Matteo's other side, her hands locked aggressively over the packed wound, practically carrying half his weight. They moved into the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, just as the muffled, heavy thuds of Rossi's men, attempting to breach the main bunker door, began to echo through the concrete. The siege of Caldwell Estate was lost, but the battle for survival in the dark, subterranean belly of the city had just begun. The subterranean air was freezing, thick with the stench of mildew, rust, and decades of stagnant water. They were moving through a forgotten auxiliary overflow tunnel connected to the massive Catskill aqueduct system, a sprawling network of underground pipes that fed New York City. The darkness was absolute, pierced only by the jagged, frantic beams of tactical flashlights mounted to Dante and Bruno's weapons. Every step was a monumental battle against gravity and failing biology. Matteo's arm was draped heavily over Dante's shoulder, his breathing reducing to a terrifyingly shallow, wet rattle. On his other side, Nora pressed her shoulder under his armpit, her hands locked in a vice grip over the blood-soaked quick-clot dressing on his abdomen. Her scrubs were ruined, saturated with a horrifying amount of crimson. "Keep moving," Dante rasped, his eyes darting toward the darkness behind them. They blew the bunker door. "I can hear the echoes." "He's crashing, Dante," Nora warned, her voice tight with panic as she felt Matteo's knees buckle again. "His peripheral pulse is gone. His body is shunting all remaining blood to his vital organs. If we don't lay him flat and get fluids into him within the next 10 minutes, his heart is going to stop." "There's no stopping here, Doc," Bruno grunted from the rear, holding Toby firmly against his massive chest with one arm while keeping his assault rifle leveled at the tunnel behind them. Toby had buried his face in Bruno's tactical vest, sobbing quietly into the Kevlar. "We stop, we die." "I have a contingency," Dante said, his breath ghosting in the freezing air, 50 yards ahead. "There's a maintenance junction. I rigged it 2 years ago when Caldwell Holdings bought the estate. Behind them, the muffled shouts of Rossi's men echoed down the concrete pipe. Flashlight beams began to slice through the gloom in the distance. They were closing the gap. Rossi had sent his elite hit squad, seasoned cartel mercenaries who tracked blood trails like hunting dogs. "Bruno," Dante barked. "Take the boss." Bruno swiftly handed Toby to Nora. "Hold on to my belt, kid. Don't let go," she instructed Toby, her voice cracking as she swapped places with the giant enforcer. Bruno practically hoisted Matteo off the ground, carrying the dying mob boss with brute, desperate strength. Dante dropped back. He pulled a small, heavy block of C4 plastic explosive from his tactical webbing, pressing it directly onto a structural weakness in the concrete archway where a rusted iron grate intersected the tunnel. He jammed a digital detonator into the explosive. "Move! Go, go, go!" Dante yelled, sprinting to catch up with the group. They scrambled through a heavy iron doorway into the maintenance junction, a slightly wider chamber with a metal ladder leading up to a storm drain. Bruno hauled Matteo through the threshold, followed by Nora dragging Toby. Dante threw himself through the heavy door, slamming it shut and spinning the rusty locking wheel. "Cover your ears and open your mouths," Dante commanded, pulling a small radio transmitter from his pocket. Nora clamped her hands over Toby's ears and squeezed her eyes shut. Dante pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, a concussive wave of pressure that punched the air right out of their lungs. The ground violently bucked beneath their feet. Beyond the iron door, the structural integrity of the century-old aqueduct collapsed. Thousands of tons of earth, concrete, and rushing subterranean water caved in, instantly crushing the vanguard of Rossi's hit squad under an insurmountable wall of debris. It was a swift, brutal execution, a dose of hard karma for the men who had just butchered Matteo's household staff. The tunnel was permanently sealed. "That buys us time," Dante coughed, waving away the thick cloud of concrete dust. "Up the ladder. The exit drops us near an old logging road off Route 17. I have a vehicle stashed there." It took agonizing minutes to hoist Matteo up the rusted ladder. When they finally pushed open the heavy cast-iron grate and spilled out into the freezing, rain-slicked woods of the Catskills, Matteo was completely unresponsive. Hidden beneath a camouflage tarp in a dense thicket of pine trees sat a battered dark blue Ford F-150. It was entirely unremarkable, completely untraceable, and devoid of the GPS trackers that plagued modern luxury SUVs. Bruno threw the tailgate open and helped Dante lay Matteo flat in the truck bed. Nora scrambled in beside him, immediately ripping open the trauma bag Dante had salvaged from the bunker. "Bruno, drive. Keep it under the speed limit. If we get pulled over, we're all dead," Dante ordered, climbing into the passenger seat with his rifle across his lap. As the truck rumbled to life and bumped down the muddy logging road, Nora clicked on a small penlight, holding it between her teeth. She checked Matteo's pupils. They were sluggish, barely reacting to the light. His skin was the color of old parchment. "Matteo," Nora whispered, slapping his cheek lightly. "Matteo, stay with me." Nothing. He had lost too much blood. The quick clot had stopped the active hemorrhaging from the torn sutures, but his vascular system was running on empty. A saline drip wouldn't be enough to carry oxygen to his brain. He was dying in the back of a pickup truck. Nora looked down at her own arm, a desperate, insane realization dawning on her. She looked at the medical supplies scattered around her. She had IV tubing. She had large-bore needles. She had an unyielding refusal to let this man die after everything they had just survived. "Dante," Nora called out, banging her fist on the rear window of the cab. Dante slid the glass open, the cold wind howling into the truck bed. "Where are we going?" she demanded. "Safe house in the Poconos. Off the grid. Belonged to an old capo who died 10 years ago. It's an hour away." "He doesn't have an hour," Nora said grimly. "And a safe house won't save him. He needs blood, Dante, right now." "I can't take him to a hospital, Doc. Rossi owns half the cops in this county. He'll have every emergency room from Albany to Manhattan watching for gunshot victims." "I know," Nora said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "What is his blood type?" Dante hesitated. "A negative. Why?" Nora closed her eyes for a brief second, exhaling a shaky breath. "I'm O negative. Universal donor." Dante turned fully in his seat, staring at her through the sliding glass window. "Are you out of your mind? You're exhausted. You're traumatized. Doing a direct field transfusion in the back of a moving truck could send you into hypovolemic shock. You could die right next to him. If he dies, your syndicate crumbles, and Rossi hunts me and Toby down to tie up loose ends. Nora fired back, her eyes flashing with defiance. I am not giving Rossi the satisfaction. Hand me the heavy tourniquets from your tactical vest. The interior of the abandoned hunting cabin deep in the Pocono Mountains was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. Bruno had managed to start a fire in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the desolate room. Matteo lay unconscious on a dusty leather sofa, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, erratic rhythm. Beside him, sitting on a wooden crate, was Nora. A makeshift intravenous line connected the thickest vein in the crook of her elbow directly into Matteo's arm. It was a barbaric, archaic medical procedure, a direct, unmeasured blood transfusion driven solely by gravity and the desperate pumping of Nora's heart. She felt cold, a deep, bone-chilling numbness creeping up her extremities as her life force slowly drained from her body and flowed into his. Her vision blurred at the edges, the shadows in the cabin stretching and dancing unnervingly. Across the room, Toby was finally asleep, curled up in a heavy wool blanket near the fire. Bruno sat near the window, his massive silhouette perfectly still as he watched the dark tree line for any signs of movement. Dante paced the wooden floorboards, a burner phone pressed to his ear. He spoke in hushed, aggressive Italian, his face growing darker with every passing second. When he finally snapped the phone shut, he looked like a man ready to burn the world down. Nora blinked heavily, fighting to stay conscious. How much? Longer? She slurred, her head drooping. Dante rushed over, examining the color of Matteo's skin. The deathly pallor had receded, replaced by a faint, healthy flush. That's enough, Doc. You're going to kill yourself. With swift, practiced motions, Dante clamped the tubing and carefully extracted the needles, applying pressure bandages to both their arms. Nora slumped forward, completely exhausted. Dante caught her, gently lowering her onto a makeshift bed of sleeping bags near the fire. Rest, he commanded softly, a rare note of profound respect in his voice. You saved him. Again. Hours later, the storm outside broke, giving way to the pale, fragile light of dawn filtering through the dirty cabin windows. Matteo groaned, the sound harsh and raspy. His eyelids fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light. Pain immediately lanced through his side, a fiery reminder of the brutal night, but his mind was surprisingly clear. The crushing, suffocating fog of blood loss was gone. He looked down at his arm, seeing the fresh puncture wound and the thick cotton bandage. He slowly turned his head. Nora was asleep on the floor a few feet away, curled protectively around Toby. Her face was dangerously pale, her scrubs a horrifying canvas of dried blood, his blood. Dante stepped out of the shadows, handing Matteo a canteen of water. Drink slowly. Matteo took a sip, wincing as the water hit his dry throat. Report, he rasped. Estate is gone. Burned to the foundations, Dante said quietly, taking a seat on the edge of the stone hearth. Rossi's men brought heavy artillery, but we sealed the tunnel behind us. We buried about a dozen of his cartel shooters under the aqueduct. They think we're dead under the rubble. Good. Let them think it, Matteo murmured. He looked at Nora again, a profound, heavy realization settling in his chest. How? She gave you her blood, boss, Dante explained, his gaze shifting to the sleeping nurse. Direct line in the back of the truck. She practically drained herself to keep your heart beating until we reached the cabin. I've never seen a civilian do something like that. She's something else. Matteo stared at Nora, a tight, painful knot forming in his throat. In his world of cutthroat betrayals and calculated alliances, loyalty was bought with money, or enforced by fear. No one gave of themselves unconditionally. Yet this woman, a stranger he had dragged into his violent nightmare, had literally poured her life into his veins to save him. The debt he owed her was insurmountable. It went beyond money. It was a blood debt. I need a phone, Matteo said, his voice hardening as the Mafia boss re-emerged, sharp and lethal. Boss, we need to stay off the grid, Dante warned. If Silas managed to give Rossi our communications protocols before we caught him, Silas was a pawn, Matteo interrupted, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. The pieces were finally clicking together in his mind. What do you mean? Silas didn't have the clearance to know the exact blind spots of the signal jammers, Matteo explained, his voice low and cold. And Rossi's hit squad hit the bunker exactly 10 minutes after the siege started. They knew exactly where the panic room was. They knew the floor plans. Silas didn't have access to the architectural blueprints. Only the inner circle does. Dante froze, the color draining from his face as the horrifying truth dawned on him. No, boss, you can't think. Carlo Matteo spat the name out like a curse. Carlo was Matteo's underboss, his right-hand man for the last decade, and the man who currently controlled all syndicate operations in the city while Matteo was supposedly recovering. It makes perfect sense, Matteo continued, his eyes burning with a cold, calculating fury. Rossi doesn't just want me dead. He wants to absorb my territory without a war. He couldn't do that by brute force. He needed a proxy. He needed someone on the inside to take over the Bianchi family and pledge loyalty to him. Carlo set me up at O'Reilly's pub. When I survived, Carlo used Silas to feed Rossi our location. Son of a bitch, Dante whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. He's consolidating power right now. If everyone thinks you're dead under that tunnel, Carlo is going to call a meeting of the commission to officially take your seat. Exactly, Matteo said, pushing himself up to a sitting position. He ignored the agonizing pull of his stitches, which means we have a very small window to hit him before he locks down the entire city. A soft rustling sound drew their attention. Nora was awake, sitting up weakly on her sleeping bag. She looked pale and fragile, but her eyes were sharp as she looked between the two men. You're going back, Nora stated, her voice devoid of fear, replaced by a weary resignation. Matteo looked at her. The fierce, untouchable mob boss felt a strange vulnerability wash over him under her gaze. I have to. If Carlo takes my seat, he'll hunt us forever. He knows you can identify his men. You and the boy will never be safe. Nora slowly stood up, leaning against the wooden wall for support. She looked at her sleeping nephew, then walked over to the sofa, standing over Matteo. She didn't look at him with the terror of a captive anymore. She looked at him as an equal, a woman who held his life in her hands and chose to give it back. Then you make sure you kill him, Nora said, the clinical coldness in her voice shocking both Dante and Matteo. You promised me that Toby would be safe. You owe me your life, Matteo Bianchi. I expect you to pay your debts. You end this. You tear Carlo and Rossi apart, and you make sure they can never come for my family again. Matteo stared at the petite nurse, absolute awe, and a dark, terrifying affection blooming in his chest. She wasn't just surviving his world, she was adapting to it. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her wrist, his thumb brushing over the bandage where she had given him her blood. I swear it on my life, Nora, Matteo vowed, his voice a low, lethal promise. I will bring you their heads. The game had changed. It was no longer just about syndicate politics or territorial control. It was personal, and the underworld was about to find out exactly what happened when hard karma came calling to collect. 72 hours later, the underworld of New York City was vibrating with a dangerous electric tension. Word had spread through the shadowed alleys and high-rise corporate fronts that Matteo Bianchi had been buried alive under the Catskill Aqueduct. The rival syndicates were circling like vultures, but Carlo had moved faster. Operating out of a sprawling, glass-enclosed boardroom at the top of the Hudson Yards Tower, a property legally owned by Lombardi Private Wealth Management, a pristine front for the Bianchi family's laundered billions, Carlo had called a summit. He had invited the heads of the 5 families to officially recognize his ascension. To guarantee his safety, Carlo had spared no expense, hiring Apex Global Security, a private military contractor known for deploying ruthless ex-Special Forces operatives. Deep in the industrial belly of Brooklyn, inside a rusted, abandoned shipping warehouse, Matteo was preparing for war. He was dressed in a pristine black suit, a stark contrast to the tactical Kevlar vest strapped tightly over his healing ribs. Dante and Bruno were loading heavy duffel bags with enough suppressed weaponry and C4 explosives to take down a small government. Nora stood by a matte black, heavily armored Mercedes Sprinter van they had procured off the grid. She wore dark jeans and a heavy tactical jacket, her medical trauma kit slung across her shoulder. Toby was safely hidden miles away at an underground safe house, guarded by Matteo's last 4 fiercely loyal men. You stay in the van, Matteo ordered, his voice brooking no argument as he approached Nora. He checked the magazine of his customized 1911 pistol before sliding it into his shoulder holster. The comms are encrypted. If Dante gives the signal that we failed, you put this van in drive and you disappear. You have the offshore account numbers for Cerberus Capital. It's enough money to keep you and Toby hidden for 10 lifetimes. Nora crossed her arms, her jaw set in a stubborn line. I am not running, Matteo. I am parking 2 blocks away. If you or Dante get hit, you'll need immediate triage. I am your medical overwatch. Do not argue with me. Matteo looked at her, the hard lines of his face softening for a fraction of a second. She had given him her blood. She was permanently woven into the fabric of his life now. You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met, he murmured, stepping close enough to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Just make sure you don't get shot again, Nora replied, her breath catching slightly at his touch. I'm running out of O-negative. Matteo offered a grim, razor-sharp smile. Tonight, I'm not the one who bleeds. At exactly midnight, the assault on Hudson Yards began. It wasn't a loud, chaotic siege like the one at the Caldwell estate. It was a surgical, terrifyingly quiet infiltration. Dante and Bruno, utilizing the original architectural blueprints Matteo had memorized, bypassed the primary security checkpoints. They used the elevator shafts, moving like ghosts through the ventilation infrastructure. When they reached the penthouse level, they encountered the first wave of Apex Global mercenaries. 2 suppressed shots echoed in the hallway, so quiet they sounded like a heavy book dropping on a carpet. The guards slumped to the floor before they could even trigger their radios. Bruno dragged them into a utility closet, while Dante sliced into the mainframe box, disabling the biometric locks on the boardroom doors. Inside the boardroom, oblivious to the ghosts moving outside, Carlo raised a crystal glass of aged scotch. He stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, looking down at the 4 oldest, most dangerous men in the city. We stand at the dawn of a new era, Carlo announced smoothly, his charismatic smile masking the treacherous rot beneath. Matteo was a traditionalist. He was weak. His refusal to expand our narcotics lines through the East Coast ports cost us billions. But under my leadership, we will absorb his territory, unify our operations, and bring unprecedented wealth to the Commission. Vincent Romano, a gray-haired, cold-eyed patriarch who had survived 3 Mafia wars, swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Matteo Bianchi was many things, Carlo, but he was not weak, and he was not careless. It is highly convenient that he was ambushed twice in 1 week. Carlo chuckled, feigning sorrow. The underworld is unpredictable, Don Romano. Enemies are everywhere. But I assure you, my security today is absolute. Is it? The voice, dark and rough as crushed glass, severed the luxurious silence of the boardroom. Carlo froze, the blood instantly drained from his face. The heavy oak double doors at the end of the room swung open. Matteo Bianchi walked in, looking like a demon resurrected from the grave. Dante and Bruno flanked him, their assault rifles leveled at the room, their eyes devoid of mercy. Gasps erupted from the seated Mafia bosses. Vincent Romano actually dropped his glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. Matteo, Carlo choked out, his hand trembling so violently he had to set his scotch down. How? You were crushed in the aqueduct. My men confirmed. Your men are buried under 1,000 tons of concrete, Matteo said smoothly, advancing toward the table with a slow, predatory grace. You always were too eager, Carlo. You mistook my patience for weakness. You thought you could sell me out, burn my home to the ground, and take my seat without consequences. Carlo panicked. He slapped his hand down on the emergency panic button under the table. Guards, get in here! Kill him! The side doors burst open. A dozen heavily armed Apex Global mercenaries flooded into the room, their laser sights cutting through the dim lighting. Carlo let out a manic, desperate laugh, backing away from the table. You're a dead man walking, Matteo. I paid Apex $10 million to secure this building. Fire, shoot him. Matteo didn't even flinch. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually in his pockets, an enigmatic, chilling smirk playing on his lips. None of the mercenaries pulled their triggers. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Carlo looked frantically at the mercenary captain, a scarred veteran holding an M4 carbine. I gave you a direct order. Shoot him. The captain slowly lowered his weapon, his face impassive. He looked at Carlo, then respectfully nodded toward Matteo. "The contract was for 10 million, Mr. Carlo," the captain stated coldly. "But Mr. Bianchi's offshore asset managers at Lombardi Private Wealth wired 30 million into our Cayman accounts an hour ago. Our contract has been officially bought out." Hard karma struck Carlo like a physical blow. His knees buckled, the sheer crushing weight of his own betrayal collapsing on top of him. He had tried to buy loyalty, forgetting that in the world of mercenaries and mobsters, loyalty always went to the highest bidder. And Matteo Bianchi had pockets deeper than the ocean. Carlo dropped to his knees, the cold marble of the penthouse floor seeping into his tailored trousers. He looked frantically at the other bosses seated around the massive mahogany table, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Don Romano, please. He's a dead man walking. You can't let him do this." Vincent Roy slowly stood up. Adjusting his silk tie with agonizing precision, he looked down at Carlo with utter disgust. "You broke the oldest law, Carlo. You betrayed your Don. You brought outside mercenaries into our business to usurp a seat that was not yours. You are a rat. The commission offers you no protection." Romano respectfully bowed his head toward Matteo. "The seat remains yours, Don Bianchi. Clean your house." The other bosses silently rose and filed out of the glass-enclosed boardroom, escorted by Dante and the newly bought mercenaries, leaving Matteo alone with the architect of his near demise. Matteo slowly drew the customized 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed loudly in the cavernous room. "Matteo, please," Carlo sobbed, crawling backward. "We were brothers. We built this syndicate together." "We were," Matteo agreed, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a hollow, terrifying absolute zero. "But you put a target on a 7-year-old boy. You forced an innocent nurse to bleed for my mistakes. For that, there is no forgiveness. Hard karma always collects its debts." A single gunshot shattered the glass walls, ringing out over the glittering skyline. The traitor was dead. An hour later, the heavily armored van sat quietly idling near the shipping docks. Nora tapped her fingers nervously against the steering wheel, her eyes darting to every passing shadow. When the back doors suddenly swung open, she gasped, her hand flying to a heavy wrench. Matteo climbed inside, smelling of gunpowder and the cold night air. The adrenaline had finally left his system, leaving him exhausted, but his dark eyes were incredibly clear. Dante closed the partition behind them, granting them absolute privacy. Nora let out a shaky breath, her clinical gaze scanning him for injuries. "Is it done?" "Yes," Matteo said softly, leaning his head back. "Carlo is gone. The war is over. But your apartment is compromised, Nora. It isn't safe." He reached forward, gently taking her small, trembling hands in his large, calloused ones. "I have a private, off-the-grid estate in Vermont. A real fortress. Excellent schools nearby for Toby. I want you to come with me. I want to protect you both." Nora stared at him. Days ago, she was an exhausted nurse. Now, she was irrevocably tethered to the king of the underworld. Yet, looking into his eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a fiercely loyal protector who had moved heaven and earth for her. "Vermont is very cold," Nora whispered, a fragile smile breaking through her exhaustion. Matteo's chest heaved with a quiet, genuine laugh. "Then we will buy a lot of blankets." Matteo Bianchi traded his ruthless empire for a quiet fortress, ruling from the shadows to ensure his family's safety. Nora traded her scrubs for a life where she healed the man who protected them. Toby grew up oblivious to the blood spilled for his future. Destiny intertwined a dying mobster and a fearless nurse, proving that even in the darkest underworld, love and absolute loyalty remain their only true salvation.